Yeah, I've grown a lot of these from cuttings. That tree right there is only 5 years old, maybe 6 on
Oh,
the
great.
end. I started 2 whole trays of them, so it was like 280 cuttings, and 80% of them took. I start my medium is 50% coconut core and 50% perlite, and then I start them in the wintertime in a box that I have because I can control the heat better. But those things start like weeds. I mean, and they'll grow. Um, those 2 little trees on the end there are like actually 2 years older than that one is. So
I
that tells you how fast they grow.
I have a question for you. Do you notice a difference in how the soil mix and container size affects the barking? Because this is barking quite a bit, and then this doesn't have
That's
very
like
much.
way older.
Oh, it's older. Okay,
This
it's just
this
age.
was I only started this 5 years ago.
Okay, and then
It
this
was in a
is,
pot 2 years and it's been in the ground the last 3 years, and that's it.
God, do you know how old this one is?
She said 2007.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Just age. Great.
just just so you know, I took these. They're actually
Redwoods, right?
2 years older. No, these here are Japanese hemlocks.
Oh, okay. Oh, great.
They're dwarfs,
Oh,
and they're
perfect.
very slow growing, and they're expensive to buy, but they start from cuttings pretty well, and it's a good for doing small trees. That's the type you kind of want because you can bring them up real slow as they come along, and then everybody wants them.
Great.
Here we go.
Actually, now is not a bad time to also talk about this tree, which is the raffles tree, I believe.
He's a little. It's a little weak because of the heat hit, and I left all the foliage on. So
Yeah, I was gonna
but a
say,
bunch needs to come off.
yeah,
That's raw right out of the growing pit.
yeah. My first feedback is that whoever gets this tree should probably let it recover because you can kind of tell side by side, just
Yeah.
a certain, just looking at the growth. It's thinner, it's drooping. This is like turgid. It's at the 90 degrees, which these tend to produce. This is not ready to be worked. This just needs to recover.
It does need to be thin. It's got too much green on top for
Right.
what's underneath.
If I got it right, I actually wouldn't thin anything yet, only because typically if a tree is weak, it wants all the solar panel it can get to recover. So, when we thin trees, we want to we want to let light into the interior and like grow interior growth. That's kind of a bonsai development technique. This is like I need to get strength before we do any bonsai to it stage. And in that case, you just don't touch.
It was just late in the year for digging them up. That's all. This is last minute.
No, it makes sense.
Thank you.
As for this tree, if no one asked me, but I guess if I was to work on this tree, I think this tree being perfectly straight and already at this thickness where it'd be hard to bend the trunk in any way, this may be a candidate for an orthodox upright tree, which is not exactly how these things grow in nature, but you could create a kind of a hinoki cypress kind of style tree with this. You have all the back buds you need for it. You have many options in terms of branching off the trunk. So I think this tree itself might lend itself to that kind of style. Yes. That I'm sure they grow in a ton of ways beyond my imagination. Where I live, I guess I live in San Francisco. I live on the coast or one part of the coast. And they tend to grow they're very influenced by wind. And I'll talk more about this once I start the presentation proper. They're very influenced by wind. So you see many variants of a windswept form. In San Francisco, I guess the arborists tend to cut them. Well, I actually don't know if it's because of how the arborists maintain them or if it's their natural growth habit, but they get really tall and they kind of have a flat top, a very low and extended flat top in San Francisco. And it may just be that they grow very vigorously and over time, like the lower branches, they just lose their lower branches. If you go over to like Point Lobos or, Monterey, you do see some diverse forms of the tree. Actually, even in Pacifica, you see some trees that are just squashed by the wind. They're just like rolling on the coast. That's one exaggerated version of wind influence. And then, at Point Lobos, if anyone has seen like the old veteran, that's a very interesting tree on the cliff of Point Lobos. Actually, a year or two ago, half the tree broke off, but that tree is chunky and like more bonsai-like, but it still has a lot of its foliage up top. It has this umbrella effect. So that was a long way to say wind and a very lateral growth habit. I guess I'll skip to it. I'm going to talk about it, but if you just notice, if you look at this tree, which has been left alone for the past half a year, it grows. It sends out runners laterally. It doesn't. There are many trees where if you leave them alone, they send shoots going straight up. These tend to favor lateral growth. So that's a bit of a natural habit of cypress. And if you see them, in the parks in SF or on the coast, they pad themselves out very naturally. They have these low profile, kind of very small and slender pads. So when I style these trees, I like to do something similar. I'm influenced by that. But yeah, that's the long answer.
So thank you all for being here. I want to introduce Sam Tan. Sam is the current president.
Previous president. Yeah.
Previous president,
yeah.
Someday ex-president of the Bonsai Society of San Francisco. He's a passionate enthusiast who enjoys creating bonsai from native North American species. Sam completed an extended study under Ryan Neal at Bonsai Mirai in 2019, and he regularly returns to the garden to refine his craft. Prior to that, Sam attended classes with Jonas Dupuis and Michael Hagedorn, and you can find his work at Instagram at Sam Tan Bonsai. And he also is one of the 6 Joshua Roth Rising Stars contestants at the GSBF Bonsai Rendezvous in October. So we are in for a treat. So enjoy his presentation. I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot. Go ahead, Sam.
Great. Thanks for having me. Well, it's my first time here. Really big crowd. It's awesome. So as you might have guessed, I'm here to talk about cypresses. I really like cypresses. Cypress may be the first. When I moved to San Francisco in 2014, I remember being at Land's End and looking at all these tall trees. I'm like, what is that? They look like Jurassic Park trees. They're so cool. Much later, when I got into bonsai, 2017 or 2018, I realized what they were, and they are the most naturally stylized tree that I see around me in San Francisco when I got into the hobby. So I think naturally I kind of took a liking to them. Today I brought all examples of pygmy cypress. I believe that's Cypress pygmea. And some people have told me they're not the same as Mendocino cypress, and some people say they are. I'm sure they're all related if they're not the same. And they're definitely some kind of cousin of Monterey cypress, which are actually the trees you see in San Francisco and Point Lobos and so on. So these aren't exactly Monterey cypress. These are pygmy cypress. So why did I fall in love with Monterey cypress and get pygmy cypress? Well, they happen to be an interesting bonsai subject available to us in Northern California. Bob Scheinman up in the Mendocino collects a lot of these. And a lot of these pygmy cypresses, I think one came from Bob and 2 came from a friend of his who also used to collect. And they grow in these kind of muddy, really acidic soil that's really anaerobic. And something about that growing condition really causes them to bark up a lot more than, it slows them down and causes them to bark up a lot. So for a tree of this thickness or this thickness or that thickness, you're getting much more bark than you would expect on a tree in that size. And so that's what kind of makes these collected pygmy cypresses interesting bonsai subjects. Monterey cypress, I guess I'm not aware of an interesting source to collect Monterey cypress, and not many people are field growing them. That being said, I did, for those of you who attended the Pacific Bonsai Expo, I did show a Monterey cypress there that was actually field grown by Eric Schrader in San Francisco for about 14 years when I bought it from him. And then it's been 3 years since, but they bark up slow. They kind of make me think of blue Atlas cedar. When you get them, they look like thick, chunky baby legs, and over time, slowly they bark, and that's what's happening to my Monterey cypress. But anyways, pygmy cypress. I'm gonna say cypresses, and a lot of the stylings that I do, I'm influenced by the form of Monterey cypress, which I see around me. I think that's authentic since, you know, they're all NorCal native coastal cypresses, definitely related. So, how many people here have a pygmy cypress or a Monterey cypress? Show of hands. Great. What are I guess what do you know about pygmy? Like, what is a pain point? What is something you really like? Okay, what is something people don't like about pygmy cypress? Let's go. Perfect. We'll talk about that. Yes, repotting can cause death. That's one thing. Anything else back there?
Specifically, the ones that you get from Shyman. I love them. I got one many years ago, and Ted Matson and I worked on that thing for like 5 years, and we did the third at a time repot, get it into better soil, and took it down. And by the time we got it into full good bonsai soil, it was bulking up and looking beautifully. But then on the 4th and 5th year after that, because it was so healthy, it lost all the turtle bark on it. The bark got slick, and year number 6, it just croaked, and it croaked fast. And I know there's several other people in the club that have had the exact same experience.
Interesting.
So could you go over what to do when you get one from scratch to keep it alive?
Yeah, so actually the first part of my presentation today will be a bit more of a lecture on all these things. And then the second half, what I plan to do is work on one of these trees. And, I won't finish the whole tree, but show you how I work on the styling of the tree. So, great. Repotting sucks. They sometimes may die. They lose the bark that you bought the tree for. All right, great. What do people like about them? Beautiful. Smell. In fact, later when I start working on one of these trees, I'll pass around some of the foliage. If you haven't experienced the lemon lime scent of cypresses, you should. It's great. Great. So yes, let's talk about that. So typically when you get these trees, I'm talking about the collected trees, not the cutting grown. Oh, sorry, there's a question back there.
I don't have one, so I'm hoping to learn from you tonight what to look for also in getting a...
Great, yeah. Well, I'm going to give you the lowdown, everything from the horticulture to the style, so you're in the right place. So great. Let's talk about this, the horticulture first, right? So when you buy these, typically you buy them collected. I told you they come in this really sandy, wet soil, and they're these thin trunks of bark, and they have interesting movement, a lot of potential, great foliage that's kind of small. And like this came in like a 5-gallon tub, like a pretty big one, this one in a smaller container. But at some point you gotta make them bonsai, and you gotta get them into a much smaller container. So there are a few ways to go about this in general. Just the philosophy of how you get, well, the approach for how you get a piece of collected material from like a tub into a bonsai container. I think a technique that's often thought that works is to first take half the soil out, right? On the first repotting, replace that with good bonsai soil. And then a few years later on the next repotting, you take the other half out and then you replace it with bonsai soil. So now you have a root system that is full of bonsai soil. And then maybe in the third repotting, or subsequent repottings, you reduce that size until you get to the size that you want. So that works. And I guess the whole idea there is that you want the roots want to be in well-draining, well-structured bonsai soil. The one of the functions of bonsai soil is, they're very granular, the soil mixes that we use. So they let a lot of air in, and, the roots kind of want that, need that balance of kind of air and moisture to grow well. Secondly, so I use 100% akadama. We'll talk about that in a sec, but the compound that is akadama is very nice because roots actually grow into the akadama particles, and as they break the particle down, like the particle breaks down as the roots divide. So I guess that's at least the theory. I'm not an expert and a horticulturalist, but at least the explanation for why akadama is so good for your trees is that they kind of break down as the root system grows finer. So what really that means is that the tree slows down and your foliage gets smaller. And when you're working with native species and their native foliage, you actually rely on the size of container and the kind of soil in there to get the foliage to get smaller and smaller. So, you know, some grafted species, some grafted varieties like juniper and so on, they already have such a small needle size that you don't really need to do that much to keep it small. But for these, you definitely will notice a difference in foliar quality and size and character over time as you take them out from the acidic sand into bonsai soil. So that's one thing. Back to how you repot these. What do? I repot them into the bonsai container on the first repotting. So the way I do it is I style them first, and I get a sense of, well, depending on the tree, I may or may not style them first, but there is a size of container that is proportionate to the size of the trunk and the intended style of the tree, right? This is almost borderline too big for my taste, but because it is low and it is flat, I think it makes sense. These two are about kind of the, roughly visually speaking, the right amount of size that I want. So how do you get it from a 5-gallon tub into this, right? So what you actually find in the 5-gallon tub or whatever tub it's in is not a lot of root. So as you're working through that thing and it sucks, you're just like, chunks of sand are just falling off. Mostly there are no roots in there. And when there are roots, they are kind of long. They're not in fine, dense clumps like you find in bonsai soil. So the way you're able to repot them into a bonsai container at once is that you take out the soil, but you save as many roots as you can. So you're not just taking out the soil and just shearing the roots bottom, left, right, front, back. You're actually taking the soil away from the roots and then working all those roots, as many roots as you can save, back into the bonsai container, because that's how the tree survives that repot. So principle one is that to get it into a small pot on that traumatic repot where it's going from big container to small container, and this applies for a tree that's going from a bonsai soil to bonsai soil, big to small container, save as many roots as you can, because the tree is going to survive on those roots until it grows new roots. So to maximize the chance of the success, you want to keep as many of those roots on as possible. So I think a mistake maybe a lot of people make is that on that first, when they shrink the container down, they shear off too many roots. And, taking off soil and root at the same time is kind of appropriate for a tree that's more established already as a bonsai. And when you're repotting it that way, you're assuming you have good roots already in the core, and that tree has enough roots remaining in the center to thrive after you cut everything off the sides and bottom. But that's not the case of a tree that has just come out of collection. So point one, that's how you do it. So right now, like for most of these trees, except for this one, this has been through a few repots, the center soil has mostly been untouched. I mostly had to reduce the roots this way and this way to get into this container. On the next repot, I'm then going to go into the center and gouge out that crappy soil and then fill that in with bonsai soil. So I have a perimeter right now of good bonsai soil and maybe a bit on the bottom, and in the center of bad soil. Second repot, as this tree, you can tell it's lifting itself out of the container. It's growing a lot of good roots. I save those roots mostly that have grown since I first repotted it. I take out the bad soil and I backfill it with good soil. And that's how you get the tree into a bonsai container and have good soil filled in much faster. That's how I do it. But there's one more really important point that I think causes a lot of trees to die. So these trees are long and have a lot of leverage. So most people think of repotting as difficult when you have a big, chunky, heavy tree, right? In some senses, the big, heavy trees are easier because they're going to hold themselves down. But if you have a long lever arm and a tree that has spindly long roots that was really held up by the density and the heaviness of that wet sand, and you take the wet sand out and you stand it up in a bonsai pot, if that tree is not cinched down and tied down like very, very tightly and very, very precisely, that tree is going to start moving. It's going to start moving, and if the tree's moving, it's not going to grow roots. It needs to be cinched down and not moving at all. And so it's tricky. It's very technical, actually, these trees. Again, you don't have big chunky roots or like giant pieces of deadwood to tie the tree down. So this tree actually is an example. This is technically just, I did do a second repot to address the angle change, but essentially it is one repot from collection. And if you look carefully, you see these tie points here with wire, 3 points around the on the root flare, I found 3 structural roots. They're not too thick. They're pretty thin. And I drilled 3 holes in the container, kind of, like a tripod, right around the base of the tree. I threaded the wire through those holes, through the root mass, going right up like this, tying right down on the structural roots. So with these 3 points of hold, this tree moves with the pot, which is how you want to tie these trees down. So I think likely a cause of failure for a lot of repots is not tying this tree down really well. And when you get them, they will not have the kind of root mass to hold themselves together. They're held in there by that heavy soil, which you are trying to remove. So that's a big, big point. So you have to be really on point and really deliberate with how you tie these trees down. This 3 tie point method is not the only way, but it is a very effective method that I learned and I've had a lot of success with. So I have after killing 1 or 2 earlier on in my career of these trees, I now have like 100% success rate repotting these trees out of collection containers into bonsai pots. But that's the secret. Any questions about that? Long answer.
What time of year do you do the repot from collective soil to
that is a great
bonsai
question.
soil?
I forgot to mention that. So my understanding and my observation is that these trees start moving much earlier than other trees. Generally speaking, an ideal time for a repot is when there is no more chance of frost, or if there's chance of frost, you need to protect, and also right before or right as the tree starts moving. And because cypresses, at least in my area, and I think even all the way up in Portland, they start moving sometimes in December or like early January. So if you hit them around December, January, earlier the better. That's when you're going to get maximum success. Yes.
Soil that you're using presently is pure akadama?
Yes, I said I'd mention that, talk about that, and I haven't. Yes, I'm using 100% akadama in all these trees. So my reasoning behind that is that, well, one, akadama is of the typical bonsai soil mix. We use akadama, lava, pumice. Of those three particles, akadama holds the most water. These trees are water-loving trees, so this helps keep them warm, and they actually like it wet. They do well. 2, akadama is the particle that helps slow the tree down. These trees are very vigorous growers, so akadama, by holding a lot of water, holding more water means the tree, you get to water it less frequently, and because of that, the wet-dry cycle happens less often, the tree grows less vigorously, plus the roots divide in the akadama. So that's also good for slowing a very vigorous tree down. Lastly, these trees grow roots so quickly, and any of you who own these trees, they fill the pot like so fast. You're going to have to repot them every few years anyway. So the fact that akadama breaks down faster than those other 2 particles is okay, because the rate of root growth is going to be such that you have to clear out the soil every so often anyway. So I've had great success with 100% akadama, but obviously you might want to adjust that. You might have to adjust how you water and so on to accommodate the fact that it's a wetter soil mix.
Question.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, we'll get you first, then we'll go to Dodie.
Oh, what size akadama do you normally use?
I have 3 sifting screens. I bought them off Amazon. They're actually like supposed to be for gold sifting. I love them because they stack and fit on top of a 5-gallon container. So I have 3 screens. I have a 1/4, 1/8, and 1/12. So typically for most of my trees, about the medium size, the torso size, my torso. I use 1/12 all the way up to 1/4. So anything that falls below that first screen as the main body of the soil. For smaller trees and smaller containers, I may go from 1/12 to 1/8 for shohin, or even a tree like this where the container is small. The smaller the particle, the more water it's going to hold. There's less air, the wetter it's going to be. So that's good. That's good for a smaller tree that needs proportionately. It's going to dry out faster, I guess. And you're also going to want to slow that tree down even more so it produces smaller and smaller foliage for that kind of size of container. Good question.
All right, one from Dodie here.
Actually, I have two. One is, have you heard of the top-down repotting system?
I read about it. Yeah.
Okay, I just wondered how that would work. And then my second unrelated question is, with our heat here in Sacramento, do you think it would be likely harder to keep the pygmy cypress here?
Great. I should probably talk about overall horticulture for this tree. Anyways, top-down repotting. Let's start with that. My understanding is that you have a chunk of soil you want to replace, right? Field soil, whatever. I had talked about the half and half, which typically is, saying you have a container, say you have a container like this. Typically, the half-half technique is to take out like the right or whatever, one side, kind of like this, and then you take out the other side later, a few years later, right? So the top-down says divide the container this way, top half and bottom half. So first, excavate the top half, fill that with good bonsai soil, and then a few years later, replace the bottom. And I think the purported benefit of the top down is that on the first repot, you get all the soil into the kind of the center portion underneath the tree, which is ultimately the portion of the root mass that you're going to keep, right? Because you might, if you have a 5-gallon container, the bottom half is eventually going to go anyway. So I guess that's a way of getting soil into that core ASAP. I haven't tried it, and I guess my sense is that, gosh, it would be hard to do depending on the kind of, for some kinds of soil, because you would have to basically go through roots, especially for this kind of tree, right? Like they have structural roots that are like half a pencil in thickness, right? So if you're working that top section of the soil and you damage the structural root, you could kill all the root underneath it in that process. So that's a bit risky if the root system is going to be more delicate. And because likely speaking, and when you get these in collection out of a collection container, they're going to have long spindly roots, right, that extend all around the container. So attacking them at the base of the tree, you may cause damage that kind of kill off all these other valuable root that you want to save. Versus when you go from the bottom, you start from the ends of the roots and you can kind of slowly work your way up and save that root. So I think from a safety perspective, for this kind of tree, I don't think I would do it, but it totally makes sense for something like a field-grown pine, where one, the field soil may not be as bad, and two, pines have thick, meaty roots that are more resilient to that kind of work. Yep. For heat, yeah, so these trees like water. They probably, I feel like they could do full sun if you can water them often enough, but I think the problem would be that most people can't water them often enough if they're in full sun to keep them like at the level of moisture they prefer. So I would definitely recommend ideally morning sun, afternoon shade in the heat in Sacramento, almost like a deciduous tree, mainly because of how water consumptive the tree is. It just grows so many roots. They like being wet and they drink water really fast. That's what it is. Great.
More.
Sure.
Sorry. Since they like so much water, would you have them in a tray?
I've been thinking about that. 'Cause I water a lot in my San Francisco backyard, and I think it's not because of the heat, it's because of the wind I get. And the wind actually causes them to basically it pulls water out of the system quite a lot too. I think that could work. If you do like a tray of some sort, just make sure that the tree is lifted over that tray, because you don't want the roots to actually be sitting in water. That would be bad for the roots. So if I had a long tray like this, I'd probably put 2 pieces of wood or something, some such, so it sits above it, so that water collecting there is kind of evaporating and increasing the humidity, but not actually soaking the roots in water. Great. So actually, so before I go into style, aesthetics is another thing. I guess I'm going to talk about these 3 trees. So I brought them here for a reason, because they're all in different stages of development. So this tree was first worked from raw material in 2020. This one, 2021, and this one, 2022. And I'm going to explain to you why they all look like the way they look like right now. So for all these trees, I had styled them first and then repotted them later. Repotted them after. Why that's the ideal way in my mind to style a piece of raw material. with a few caveats, because when you style the tree, you may change its angle dramatically. And typically speaking, when you just do a styling on a tree, which is to say you're taking a lot of foliage off, you're reducing it quite a bit to, you know, achieve like one iteration of its style, right? To set the structure and so on. The tree's gonna have a lot less foliage. Consequently, you typically don't want to repot that tree in you know, too soon after that, because the tree doesn't have all these battery cells to go help regrow the roots, right? You're then going to take a lot of the roots off. And typically you want to work one or the other. If you're going to do major root work, you typically want to leave a bunch of foliage on. If not, don't touch the foliage for that half the season. And vice versa. If you work the foliage quite a bit, maybe don't work the roots. The most aggressive schedule I've been able to get away with is right before the spring push of growth. I style it then. So that's a good time to style. We'll talk about that soon. But you style it then, and then I leave it alone for the whole growing season to just grow out. So it kind of looks like this. And this has been left to grow out for a different reason. It had a health setback last year. But even though it was styled and it was beautiful at some point, I'm letting it grow 360. I'm not trying to pull off the bottoms and trying to, you know, make this look good for the rest of that year. I just want it to grow a whole bunch of foliage as much as it can, so that in December, it has enough foliage that I can repot it. And so I've achieved both the full reconfiguration of its angle, setting of the bones, and like choosing all the branches and so on, and a repot in a 1 year period. And that works for me. Obviously, if you style the tree and then in January and in December, it's looking like that, then maybe don't repot, because something else might have gone wrong that year. But assuming all things go well, that is the most aggressive schedule I would recommend for a tree right out of collection. Another way you can go about it, which would be more conservative, is to maybe repot first, right? Again, make sure you're on point with the repot. And again, maybe going straight into the bonsai container is not for everyone if you aren't as confident about your repotting skills, but whatever repot you choose, do that first repot in December, in January, and then wait for the tree to recover. At the very least, wait 6 months until about this point in the year. And if you are seeing positive signs of the tree recovering, and positive signs basically looks like this, the tree is sending out vigorous runners, that's the earliest time you can work the tree again. So you could do a December repot and then a June style. It's less good, and we'll talk about timing in a sec, but that's another way to do it. Or, you know, don't, you know, wait all the way till next December and then style it. So that's another way I would go about this. Great. So actually about these 3 trees, I'm going to quickly talk about it, quickly talk about them. So this tree now is in.
Got a question here from Vince real quick.
Oh yeah, sure.
You're talking about repotting in December.
Yes.
But in San Francisco, you don't have the frost that we have here.
Yeah. Oh, that's right.
No, is it still advisable to repot in December and end up with the frost hitting it in January, February?
That is a great question. I totally forgot about the different climate. I don't often come up here in the winter. That is a good point. So there's a trade-off there. In December, you can probably get away with the most aggressive root work because, again, it's right before when they push. You know, when the tree is actually moving and spending energy on growing new foliage, if you mess with its roots, it's more likely to result in failure. So that's the principle of why we do it earlier, because they start earlier. But you have to protect from frost. So it's almost like, well, if you have to wait till March or February or whenever the last frost, you're past the last frost, then maybe you have less flexibility, the root work you can do, but then you don't have to protect them. Trade-offs.
What about repotting earlier? Like some of our junipers, we kind of repot some of them in October.
Oh, okay. Well,
or a little earlier than that, so that they have still have a little bit of warmth in order for the roots to develop. Would that work on here?
You know, I haven't tried that, and because of how vigorous they are in growing roots, that may work. Though fall repotting is not typically what I do for most of my trees, but I mean, most ideally, if you have a way to protect from frost, if you can take them into the garage when there is a frost and take them out, then I recommend December. If you have to do really major root, I don't have experience of repotting them in the fall, so I can't really say how much success you're going to get. Because my suspicion is if you repot in October, yes, they will still grow some roots until they slow down, but you're still going to have to deal with the frost anyway. Like they're probably not strong enough to endure those frosts in January anyway, in which case maybe do it a bit later. So back to this tree. So I consider this tree actually, so this tree has been repotted, I want to say 2 times now. So actually most of the old soil is out. It's very established in this container. I need to repot it next year because I can't water this enough and it's super root bound. The foliage on this over time in domestication has taken on a bit of a different character. In fact, for this tree, I feel like it's gone a bit plump in a way that I don't know what I feel about it, but the foliage character has really changed from something like this to something like this. It's a bit more fat and full. I don't mind that, but it's a bit different. So that's one thing to point out. 2, this tree is growing much slower. So last year, this tree did not send out any runners at all, and I was a little bit concerned. And so I haven't really dialed the tree in, pulled off the bottoms, really made this a nice tree. And this year, it's finally starting to send out a bunch of runners, which is a good sign. And I'm actually going to hold off on working it just a little bit because I want these new pieces of growth, all the new pieces of growth all over, to help the tree photosynthesize, build some sugars, let the tree store a bit more energy before I cut all that new stuff that it just spent energy growing. But I brought this tree to show you an example of how, what a more mature version of this tree and this tree could look like in terms of foliar density, the pads, and so on. These 3 trees are also styled like slightly differently, and my vision of how to work these trees has kind of changed over time. This tree, someone told me it looks like the Space Needle, and I guess maybe it kind of does. I thought it reminded me, because of all these upward rising pieces of deadwood, of this particular tree in Point Lobos on the Cypress Trail or Cypress Grove. All the way at the top, there's a tree of a whole bunch of rising deadwood and all the foliage up top. And I had this tree left over from a forest planting that I did, and it's kind of too long to fit in that forest. It wasn't good for the forest, but I thought it would make it kind of an interesting naturalistic styling of that tree. And so I actually wanted all the foliage to be on top in kind of this flat top wind influence form. But over time, like every time I work this tree, I work to create a bit more space between these pads, because I think this design is the most interesting when you can see some of those layers and you keep that foliage, the foliage pad low profile. So this will be worked soon. This tree was next in line. This tree was 2021, and this tree has moved along really fast. So this tree, styled it at the start of the growing season in 2021, end of 2021, repotted it into this container, wired it a second time in last year, and I just removed almost all the wire from this last night. I actually should have removed this too. I just couldn't finish last night. It was last minute. And now it's ready for its 3rd wiring. So in 2 wirings and basically 2 years, this tree is like starting to mature in this form. We'll talk more about the style later, but just to show you how far and how quickly you can develop these trees if you're doing things right, well, they can move fast. This tree, last year, 2022, I didn't do all the wiring on this. I had a friend who was helping me and I was helping him learn wiring. So actually most of the wire was his, but it was fully wired. And I brought this tree as an example of what you need to do after you do your first wiring on the tree. It looks beautiful immediately after you wire it, and you need to let it grow out, thicken. You want some of that structure to set. You want the tree to grow strong again before you come all the way in, and then you restyle it a second time. If you style a bonsai like this the first time, it looks beautiful, and then you just keep pinching everything back to that first styling, it will forever remain at the maturity of that first styling. So the point I'm trying to make here is that with the first stylings, typically you style it first, and then you let it get overgrown to some point, and then you pull it back into the second styling. The second styling, you let it get overgrown, but to a lesser extent, and then you pull it back. So this is like second styling. Yeah, it's a bit overgrown, but not to a crazy extent. You can mostly see the pads, and I've let it accumulate enough energy that I think it will respond well. And then in later stylings, actually, if this tree didn't have a health setback last year, I would have already worked on this, and the tree basically will swing less from a state of surplus to a state of deficit to a state of surplus to a state of deficit. So kind of in the method I use to refine my trees, you can think of it as a pendulum swing. The tree is like hulked up, raw material, just crazy. You reduce it all the way here to like, not very little, not deliberately, but much less than, what it built up. And you let it hulk out again, but less so, you bring it back. And eventually a show-ready refined tree, every year it pushes out an even and small amount of growth. You cut some of it off. It responds with an even milder set of, next flush. Next year you cut off just a little bit, and then this happens. And at some point, maybe that tree needs a break. And when the tree needs a break, you let it grow out, and you leave that elongated growth there for a bit longer so the tree can store more sugars, and then you bring it back into this pendulum, if that makes sense. So that's the process. I also just talked a lot. Does that make sense? Does that theory kind of make sense? Great. So the very last thing is like timing. When do we prune these trees, right? I've kind of touched on this. There is with temperate varieties, and especially for conifers, you can kind of think of the tree's yearly cycle as the following. In the spring, the tree has a bunch of sugars in it, right? At some point, it spends that sugar to grow all this new foliage. And at the same time, the foliage is generating sugar through photosynthesis. You can think of it as, in the spring, the tree is primarily focused on spending its sugar to grow more foliage, right? Not that it's not photosynthesizing, it is, but it's spending more than it's earning, if that makes sense. Later in the second half of the year, in the fall, or as you transition from the summer into the fall, it's spending more time photosynthesizing and earning than it is growing. And also in the fall, it's spending less of its time growing foliage and spending more time growing tissue, vascular tissue. So typically, you want to work the tree when it's in some state of surplus, meaning as it is spending its energy growing foliage. For many trees, you don't want to touch them. You don't want to touch the tree when it's doing that. Like junipers, you don't really touch them in the spring. You wait till this is why you wait till the growth is hardened off. When the growth is hardened off, it means that these new tips, when they start off, they're they're kind of watery, they're wet, they're kind of fleshy. They're not photosynthetically efficient pieces of growth yet. They're new pieces of growth, and at some point they develop a waxy covering, and they become more kind of productive members of that tree's canopy. At that point, that's typically a sign that the tree is now is starting to accumulate a surplus, right? And the longer you wait after the tree has hardened off, the more time you're letting that tree earn back that energy, right? So you can use that timing to basically manipulate, kind of control the kind of response you get. So if you prune a tree immediately as it hardens off, what you can expect is a mild response. So the tree has barely had time to earn back a lot of that sugar. You cut off not all the new growth, but a lot of that new growth. The tree is not going to have a big bank of sugar then grow of strong second push. If you don't touch that and you wait all the way to October, or you wait all the way to the spring before it sets itself up for the next spring and you prune it then, that tree is taking the half the growing season's worth of sugar and then exploding. And that's what you want when you first style a tree, but that may not be what you want when you are dealing with a refined bonsai. And so with refined bonsai, you might work in them earlier in the season, and you probably want to work them, assuming they're healthy, every time after they harden off. I chose this time of year for this presentation because all these trees are now healthy. I'm actually only going to work on this tree because these two trees had a bit of a health setback last year. So just to be conservative, I'm going to wait one more month for the trees, and this tree maybe 2 more months to let the trees recover a bit more before I work them again. So that's timing. Lastly, With cypresses, I know some people have suggested to me that you could pinch them, and I think in theory that could work. What pinching is in the spring, as the tree is producing that soft, fleshy growth, you come in and you take some of that off. And typically what that does, it tells that tree, hey, stop spending your energy making this thing really long. Spend that all that sugar on all the other things behind it. So for trees that are so vigorous that they can afford to have some of that spring growth kind of wasted, you can use that as a way, through the spring to tell the tree, essentially redirect where the tree is like investing its resources. So you definitely do this, for trees like redwoods, super vigorous. If you leave a growing tip alone, it will go like this and it would neglect everything behind it. That's why you pinch. In theory, I think you could pinch cypresses because they're so vigorous as well. And again, if you leave them alone, they just do this. I have had success just leaving that alone, waiting for it to harden off and then pruning back. Because I do think that even though they elongate quite a bit, you still get growth behind the elongating tip that you can eventually cut back to. That's not true for all trees, but for cypresses, I leave them alone in the spring. I don't pinch. Seems to work pretty well. Okay, that basically is all the horticulture, well, the techniques and timing around cypresses that I really have to talk about. Any questions about that? All right, seems to make sense. I guess I'll very quickly talk about my aesthetics of cypress. I fell in love with these trees looking at their cousins, Monterey cypresses, out on the NorCal coast. So again, like I said, lateral growth, very short pads. A lot of them show the influence of wind. So these are 3 different attempts at kind of playing off those kind of aesthetic principles. Something that's interesting about these trees too is that they naturally favor lateral growth instead of vertical growth. So if you notice, this tree is really sending out horizontal shoots instead of shoots going straight up. So that already kind of in some sense helps you out. These trees are going to elongate and give you those running tips that you can use to kind of create like a wind influence design. I tend to keep the pads short. I tend to keep them small and separated. I think that creates a more interesting tree. Also, when you get these trees, someone asked, how do you select a good pygmy cypress? Actually, that's an open question. How do people select their pygmy cypress? For those of you who have bought pygmy cypress, what do you like? How do you pick? What's a good pygmy cypress and what's a bad one? Anyone?
I'm looking for a wood jig type for something like on the right.
Sure.
Yeah, it just depends on what I'm looking for at that time.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Ones I picked from Bob have the most barky trunk and the most movement in the trunk. That's what appeals to me. So
right. That makes sense. So that pretty much is how I pick them too. I think, from the pool of pygmy cypresses I've seen, and I haven't seen all of them, but I've seen quite a few, they tend to be long. They tend not to have dramatic taper. They tend not to be chunky, strong trees. They tend to be long, somewhat elegant trees. And typically with material like that, you're trying to pick an interesting line. These have varying degrees of interest in their line. Actually, this probably has the most interesting and dynamic line. This has a bit more presence, but a less interesting line. And that, I think, has the least interesting line, but has, I really like the thin deadwood going upwards. It reminded me of a particular tree I have a thing for. So 1, line. 2, bark, right? Because one reason you're buying these is that for something, yay thick, you're probably not going to find bark this thick anywhere else. That actually brings, I forgot to mention how to keep that bark. We'll get there. And lastly, something important actually is structure. So when you actually finally end up designing these trees, right? The tree is going to give you more options and going to be more interesting if the tree has more points of origin off the trunk. So what do I mean, right? This tree was challenging because if you look at the trunk line, up till here where the tree kind of forks off into a bunch of, it kind of splits off into one or two splits up here. There is nothing else below it except for this branch, right? And this branch itself is very long and only splits off up here. So sure, I could maybe have bent this branch down and created maybe one more lower layer, but I couldn't do, if I wanted a piece of foliage here, a piece of foliage here, a piece of foliage here, I would have to do some pretty contrived things with this branch to get foliage down there, right? So in that sense, because of the lack of structural points of origin off this trunk, I already have less possibilities of this tree. And with that is like, there's some value to it too. I think, there are ways to get foliage down there, but it would be better in some sense if I wanted a piece of foliage here, if there's a piece of, there's a branch originating here, then if I have to bend this down and turn it out, right? That's a bit of a sleight of hand, depending on how you do it. It may or may not be interesting. With this tree was nice. It actually had this used to be alive, but unfortunately it faded, but there is a, substantial branch down here, right? So it allows me to do things in this portion of the tree. Without this, the whole tree would be up here, which can still be good and interesting, but it precludes the possibility of doing something interesting and organic down here. So this piece of structure is actually significant. I would pay more for a tree with things down here than a tree that, had nothing down here. Also, this tree has a significant and interesting structural split up here, which again, allows me to create more depth in the tree that's a bit more interesting than if this tree didn't have this back piece and it's just like a single piece going up. There are many cypresses like that. So I like that too. And I think that is something that I picked for. This tree is weird. This was another reject from a batch of trees I bought for a forest planting. But then I looked at it and this tree had actually pretty interesting dynamic trunk movement. And it actually had this weird jog in the branch that was totally natural. It's like a sharp, acute angle going up and down. And, for more quirky styles of tree, we tend to look for movement in the branch that would be hard to create with wire. Like, if you created a 180 of wire, you'll see that curve. It's going to have a naturalness to it, but it's really hard with wire to create something that's sharp like this, right? And when I was styling this tree, I thought I could remove that if I wanted to do something more orthodox, but you're not going to find too many trees of a branch that goes up and down like this. And so I thought that made the tree a bit more interesting. Over time, I'll play up this theme a bit more, but I tried to do this up, down on the left side, and I won't go too much into that. But basically, yeah, structure, bark, and movement of the trunk. Like those are things I look out for in cypress material. Last thing I forgot to mention, you want to keep the bark on these things. And so like the gentleman over there mentioned, if you feed these really heavily, they can just bulk up and just shed all that bark. So what's going to happen, and you're seeing it a bit here, but I've kept it under control, is that this new layer of like baby young trunk is just like expanding and it's pushing out all this bark, right? And these trees typically do that when you put them in a domesticated soil. They're really happy, they're being watered, they're being fertilized, and they grow very rapidly. So another reason I put them in full akadama is I want to slow them down. And I control my fertilizer too. I do no more than a light dose throughout the year. Some people don't fertilize them in the spring. Maybe if you want to slow them down even more, don't fertilize in the spring, wait till the fall. But you want to control the rate at which that is thickening, because believe me, no matter how small the container, if you feed them enough, they will just thicken and you will lose that bark. Over time, you're going to get a new bark that is less linear in nature. It's more like scaly. If you actually look at that, the small cutting that was grown I talked about just now, you can see that bark. It looks more like it's like an alligator skin kind of bark, but it's a very different bark character. So watching your fertilizer on these is important. So after your first styling, for example, it's typical for many other species of trees to hammer them a fertilizer, heavy fertilizer, because you want it to thicken and set its structure and like grow a lot more foliage. With these, you might step it down a notch. You might go like a moderate dose, maybe a light dose, because you want to account for the rapid growing habit of the tree, and you want to keep that bark. So very important.
Question.
So Sam, when you were talking about if you had a choice of trees that you were looking at, if that tree had a little bit lower foliage, it would be more desirable. So it made me wonder if you can ever graft on them, or does this bark preclude that?
That's a good question. I haven't tried. And I have to imagine maybe it's probably possible, given how quickly they grow. I would probably pick the time of year carefully, because if you notice, these trees ooze a whole bunch of sap as well. So my guess is, like kind of like a pine, you'll probably wait till a colder point of the year where they're not moving, probably less sap, and try to graft it. I don't graft a lot, so I'm not a grafting expert. So maybe, don't take this advice from me, but aesthetically, I don't love grafting in the trunk, because to make that union, like if I had to grow a branch like this off the trunk, like I want something like this down here, it would take quite a while for this trunk to develop that maturity and that graft union. You have to do graft union well, and the trunk needs to thicken for a while until it looks like an organic primary structural branch. And so it's probably doable, but just know the trade-offs. You might have to wait a while. If you think that having a branch here would make it a better tree, it could, but you also need to make sure that that branch has merit, and it takes a while to grow a primary branch that has merit.
I don't have a question. I just want to say that I really like that you're playing with being unorthodox when you notice a cork in a tree. Oh. And you use that to make the tree interesting. I love that.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Also lets me make the tree faster, but I like it. I think these trees could be styled probably pretty similarly to a juniper if you wanted to, because the foliage has a striking resemblance. You could make, you could bring all the branches down and make a bonsai off like a bunjin style. Actually, many people talk about bunjin. I don't consider any of these bunjin. This is kind of a weird wind take on like something that only vaguely is bunjin, right? Because like, I think a bunjin is there are very specific cultural and aesthetic nuances of bunjin that I don't, claim to be conveying any of these trees, but they are long and extended and quirky, and they show a lot of line. It's less about a big chunky piece of foliage and more about sparseness. So in that sense, I think the way I worked all these trees kind of have those elements of bunjin, but they're definitely not bunjin. Bunjin is its own thing, and yeah, I'm not an authority on bunjin, so that's where I'll stop. But thank you. All right, thanks everyone for sticking around. So what I plan to do in this second half is kind of work on this tree. So this will be this tree's third full wiring. I had removed, like I said, most of the wire off this tree. This part still has the wire on. When I get home tonight, I don't expect to finish this tree in 1 hour. So I'm probably not going to get there. And so when I get back at night, I'm going to take off all this wire and then rewire that part of the tree. Oh, thank you. So I guess, the way I develop a lot of my trees, I rely pretty heavily on wire. So every time actually, why do we wire trees? What do we get with wiring? Movement, styling, shape. That's right. So, we're moving a branch into a certain place for an aesthetic purpose, right? And we want the tree to grow into that position. We want the tree to thicken, and then eventually we want it to set in that, set that shape, set that position, so one day we won't need wire. Something else about styling and putting branches in positions that's important is the kind of the physiology of the plant. You are reconfiguring what the plant is prioritizing and what it is not, right? By taking a branch that's going straight up and laying it down, for example, you're telling the plant, you are causing the hormones in that branch to be reallocated, right? As the tree is naturally growing up, I'm not an expert at this, but the way in which oxygen accumulates at the tip will change when you lower the branch down. So you may take a branch that the tree has prioritized for rapid growth and you may have told it to reprioritize that growth with something else you put on top of it. So you are reconfiguring the tree's entire system of what growth to prioritize, not just by the position of the branch, like, well, of the branch on its own, but also where it is relative to other branches. So this is significant because a big decision I've had to make of this tree over time is that this pad here, I think, is necessary. I think I want to keep it, but it sits right below this, right? So over time, this is only going to get weaker just because of the shade it's going to get. And so if I want to keep this pad, at some point, I'm going to have to do something about this, or I take this off, right? Choose one or the other, or maybe I move this away. Maybe I move these aside, you know, maybe I lower this down a bit more. So that's all to say that the styling itself is not just aesthetic, you know, you have to consider the kind of the system that is the tree, and you want to set it up for success. An unsustainable design would be one where many prominent features are hiding right under another. Over time, that growth is going to be less strong. It's going to be darker in color. It's going to be weak, and it's going to backbud less, and it's going to die off. So you can get away with some of these moves depending on the species, like for 1 or 2 stylings, but in the long term, you have to make those decisions. So the wiring and the styling is both aesthetic and also there's a plant physiology effect of it. So today I'm going to focus on some of the aesthetics of this. So with this tree, I did something a bit different. And instead of exploring just like a lateral, like straight lateral movement, I wanted to do a bit of lateral and up. And this is something I see at the trees at Point Lobos. They're not just going this way. Depending on where the wind's blowing, some of them go up this way. And it's actually very typical of a lot of mountain trees as well. We think of a lot of alpine trees as like heavy snow-laden trees of the branches straight down, but actually a lot of the trees in the Sierras, they're like moving up. I've been experimenting with that in this tree. That's why you can see that everything has like a bit of a 30-degree upward slant to it. And I kind of want to see whether I can mature these pads in this way, in a way that just both shows maturity in cultivation, but also a naturalistic image of kind of wind going this way. So that's what I'm going to do. The other thing about this tree that has been troubling me for a bit is over time, after like the second styling, the tree has grown very healthily. It's grown very dense. And these pads have gotten big. Like this is big. This is pretty big. These big chunks. And if you look at it, the tree, you know, for a pygmy cypress, this is a nice kind of biggest trunk. But relative to the pads, I think the pads are getting a bit large for, you know, the thickness of this trunk and also the kind of character of the tree, which is, you know, it doesn't have super interesting movement and it's kind of a long tree. So one thing I'm going to explore as I wire this today is how can we make something like this, which is a fine and dense and pretty pad? Can we maybe break it up slightly, just create some breaks in the pad that can start giving us maybe 3 tiers instead of 2 or 3 tiers instead of 1, right? And then I kind of, you know, what I want is for you to read these pads as smaller pads instead of this one big pad right here. And I think that will work a bit better for this tree. That's my sense. So just small degrees of adjustment. I put some of this wire on while you guys were having fun. So just adding some lateral and vertical offsets. We're already starting to see this kind of lighten up with just a bit of negative space between each of these pads, right? So I'm not done. I'm just moving some of these branches in place, right? And typically when I style trees, I like to start from the lowest branch. Why would you start from the lowest branch? Anyone has ideas? But why does the lower branch give you that and not like the upper branch? That makes sense? That makes sense. Okay, let's go with that. Better perspective. Any other ideas?
The wind swept look, does it help set the direction for the rest of the tree?
Yeah, it kind of does. And that also has to do with the fact that I like to fully style out a branch so that in my mind, I have, if I like what's going on here, I can carry on that theme through the tree, right? I can figure out things like, okay, well, given what I have, what size of foliage pads am I creating? And then I can go ahead and adjust everything else accordingly. Also, typically for most bonsai designs, the lowest branch will be a bit of a point of limitation. One, it tends to be the weaker branch, just because trees tend to like to prioritize stuff on top. It gets more sun. That's what most trees do. Also, lengthwise, especially on a tree that has an approximately triangular shape. This not exactly, but most trees have an approximately triangular shape. The lowest branch has to be the longest. So if you pull that lowest branch back, everything else has to be pulled back accordingly. Whereas if you start from the top, and let's say I wanted to make this a triangle, which I don't. And then I said, okay, well, the top pad is going to be this wide, right? And then I get all the way down here and I'm like, all the length, I only have this much length, then I can't achieve that triangle. I can't, the lowest branches can't reach out to get sunlight and to achieve the shape I want. So the lowest branch, figuring out that limitation and then adjusting everything else further up where you typically have more options, that tends to make sense for me, for my process. Also, this tree is in its third styling. So
we have another comment here, Sam.
Would you have the lowest branch also the longest one?
That's a good question. Typically, trees not only have a longest branch, but they have like a character branch, a defining branch, a directional branch in typical bonsai design. And typically that's the lowest branch, right? Because it's the longest. And a long character branch kind of gives you a sense of the overall direction of the tree, like where is the design flowing. But this tree, I'm unsure, because if you look at Monterey cypresses, a lot of them have the longest branch up top. And that's actually typically how I style a lot of my Monterey cypresses. I have the farthest branch be somewhere up top. For this, that's an interesting question. I actually don't know. I suspect one of these will actually be the longest branch. That doesn't mean that that's going to shade out this branch because it's longer up top. The way you accommodate that is you offset them laterally so light can still come in. If you just had them stacked on top of each other, then of course the lowest one has to be the longest because otherwise it's not going to get any sun. So the answer is I don't know. We'll figure it out. So anyways, the other thing I was going to say is that you're noticing that even though just with some structural wire, and I mean, by structural, I typically mean like the heavier gauge wire coming off the trunk, I'm already starting to achieve a bit of a bonsai look. And that's because this is on its third styling, right? If I put that same wire on this tree, which is much less mature, I'm going to have to put more and more wire on some of those smaller branches to get them to perk up. But this tree has had the benefit of a few wirings. Well, if you look underneath, it's starting to develop like a woody structure all the way out to the tips, right? And typically, with a lot of bonsai, you want that woody scaffolding upon which you have fresh green growth that you can then kind of clip and grow, and you can refine the tree. This tree is like slowly getting there. It's not totally there yet, so we're going to start applying wire on some of these finer branches. But I kind of want to show you the process of like setting some of these pads, and or at least how I do it, and we'll be able to see the contrast between some pads that are done and some pads that are not. Also, you'd be surprised with some of these native trees, especially in a more raw form, how heavy a gauge of wire you have to use sometimes to get these to cooperate with you. Because you might be thinking, well, it's this long, skinny tree. Surely it doesn't need the kind of wire that a big, strong, chunky tree needs. It depends, because if you have a more elongated design, and you want to control the shape of a branch over a longer stretch, you typically need 1 gauge up, right? So I'm running these wires pretty long because this design is long, and so I need heavier wire. So actually to move this branch here, that's 6 gauge. And there's not much more to, go after that. This tree at this piece of structure here on the fork, this was a 4 gauge bend. And I totally needed the 4 gauge bend to create any kind of movement in this thick piece. It's, what is this? 3/4 inch diameter. But over this short length of branch, that's what it needed to get movement. And that's what I needed. I needed movement if I was going to save that piece of the trunk structure. So yeah, don't underestimate the kind of wire that you need to make this happen. I am using copper. I typically use copper. I use copper for all my conifers. What are the benefits of copper? It's So yes, all of the above. So we're using annealed copper, right, which is heated in a way that makes it soft when you first touch it. And as you work the wire, it gets its natural stiffness back and it becomes stiffer. So it helps you set that shape, right? Also, yes, copper is for the same thickness, copper has more hold than aluminum, right? So what that actually means is that you use to achieve the same kind of movement, you use a thinner gauge wire. Why is this a good thing for why is this desirable, using thinner wire? Yeah, it looks better. And for conifers, especially for many conifers, your wire is going to stay on there for a long time, because most conifers grow slower, much slower than, say, a deciduous tree, where you may take the wire off as soon as 2 weeks or 4 weeks. So and also copper patinas, in a way, like, this tree is fully wired, but the copper is darkened out. And if you apply the wire well, the copper kind of disappears. I will say, though, that for pygmy cypress, they grow really fast. They thicken really fast, especially in early stages of development. And you may only, I've only been able to keep the copper wire on there for like 1 to at most 2 years before needing a full rewire. So all the wire, if you leave it on for too long, will end up choking the plant's growth, right? It'll thicken to a point, it'll thicken around the wire to a point where it's going to hurt that branch's growth. It's going to strangle it. So yes, well, obviously you need to take it off at the right time. And actually, in this sense, copper is worse, because I guess the thinner the thinner the wire, I guess, that's strangling the plant, it's more like a piano wire, right? It's going to actually bite in some sense faster than, because the tree doesn't have to grow around as thick a piece of wire. So you got to watch out for that. And the last thing about copper versus aluminum is that copper is more abrasive. So for trees with a very sensitive bark, and that's like many certain deciduous species, like a beech, for example, you don't really want that copper rubbing against the trunk that you want to keep scarless and that you want to show in out of leaf. So that's definitely something to consider as well. You probably get along perfectly fine for the most part using aluminum for your conifers. It's going to look a bit worse. The wire is going to be a bit thicker, but it's going to work. Though there will be certain gauges, you just have to gauge correctly. And again, you're going to have to use a thicker gauge to hold the same, similar moves. So kind of at the upper end of like what you have to do if you have to move a really thick piece, you may not have space to fit the right gauge of aluminum in some junction that you need to work in. So copper in that sense gives you a few more options.
Are you ever wrapping with raffia or something else?
Oh yeah, so raffia in general lets you do lets you get away with a more severe bend. And raffia does that by holding the tissues, the plant tissue together as you kind of apply, typically as you're stretching it, stretching it and potentially tearing it during bending, right? So if you're about to bend a branch like this, the plant tissue for many trees wants to go like this or even like this, right? So the raffia just like holds it in there so you can bend more. One, I'm not doing very significant bends I'm not doing any significant bends on this tree, right? Like even though I put 6 gauge here, I'm probably moving this by this degree, no more. And two, pygmies are pretty flexible, pretty flexible, pretty forgiving. So I don't think I'm going to be needing any raffia today. It won't hurt to apply raffia if you're sure about a bend. Assuming, well, I guess the only harm you could cause is if you apply the raffia poorly, you could, start knocking off foliage as you're putting that raffia on, and that wouldn't be good. So something I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to create a wind influence kind of styling, right? So one something that's really helpful to visualize when I'm doing this is that I'm trying to create triangular pads. So in kind of a classical like juniper styling or many conifer stylings, you lay the foliage out. Well, typically how you do a pad is, you lay the foliage out in kind of like a fan like this, right? And this will be the silhouette. And then maybe you lay more things above it. And this is how you create the body of the pad. So this would be a classical pad, a fan pad. For me, I found success with basically creating a triangular pad to show wind influence, where instead of having all this be kind of roughly, rounded in their silhouette, I have that middle piece be further. So I have more of this angle, right? So I leave more of running tip. I reduce the sides a bit more. And then for the body pad, there's still body, but it may not be placed as high. It may be placed a bit low. And sometimes, if you don't have something growing from behind it, you may move something up like this. So, but you basically don't want to create, I don't want to create this, right? I'm trying to create maybe something like this, and then I prune to silhouette. So that's something we're going to do here. So like I said, fan shaped pad, right? So if I decide that this is the running tip I want to keep, then this and this kind of come off and they get shorter, like so. This is the first tree I've gotten to wire this whole season, and I have to do it live, which is exciting. No pressure at all. It is all the warm up for GSBF. That's right. That's why I'm doing this. For those of you who own Monterey, who own pygmy cypress, you're probably familiar with the growth habit of these trees, which is that they tend to produce growth that's like this, like cross shaped. And you can see an example in the maybe the cutting's no longer here. I think that lady left. But they produce 2 shoots to the right and left, and then top and bottom, right and left, top and bottom. I found that over time, they start getting more angular. So something about keeping them in cultivation, like gives me less of that 90 degree and more of like a, what is this? Like a, now it's gone down to, 45. But when you first start and when you have those angles, typically when you want to reduce length, you have to cut this off, right? And then now you have 2 shoots going left and right. And then what's going to happen is that one or both of them will take off this way, which is still not what you want early on. And then maybe you take one of them off eventually, and then you wire this one forward, right? And then you might have to do that again a few times. But as they get more angular, it is more likely that, actually you can see here is a angular junction. So if I wanted to keep some of this length, I can cut this off and I still have an acceptable angle, right? So that I may not have to wire it forward. But at the start, you have to deal with that 90-degree, which means that in the early training of these trees, you need a bit more wire. So, just embrace the fact that wiring is part of the development of these trees, and that is totally fine. So, for those of you who went to the Pacific Bonsai Expo, I showed the Monterey cypress on the show, and that was a few years into its current styling, and I was talking about it just now to some people who are up front, but something I'm still exploring and still trying to figure out is what shape in the long term I want to achieve for these pads, right? Because that particular tree, if you remember it, it's starting to develop a bit of that branch maturity that you typically see in in a juniper or a cypress, where the undersides of these pads over time they get more woody. You get these kind of fingers lifting the pads up a bit, and then that green mass starts being kind of a bit higher up in the pad. And that's typically a desirable thing in a classically styled bonsai, because it shows that that pad has been there, has been set there for a while, and someone has diligently grown this tree slowly, plucked off the bottoms. Eventually, those bottoms mature, get a bit woody, but they're still really thin, and the foliage is above it. So that's like branch maturity. But with a tree that where I want to maintain kind of a running tip and the look of wind, if I get too much of that branch maturity, I'm going to have this, and then I also want this, right? And I feel like that aesthetic kind of conflicts with this. And to kind of balance those two, like I do want to show some branch maturity, but not too much where it starts becoming, the tree becomes less directional. And even for trees that have a lot of that branch lift, at some point it gets to the point where you have to rewire the whole tree down because it's just a little too much. It's too leggy. Yeah, I'm trying to see what that looks like for cypress. So anyways, I'm talking too much. I should style. So this is starting to look like one of those pads that I want, right? And this pad is like yay small. It's like way smaller now, which makes it interesting. The way you can control the size of a pad you're creating is by basically introducing breaks, like spaces. Well, I should wire it, but I'll talk about this. So if you have a big pad, it's like this, right? You have this huge lump. You can, if you want to soften it a bit, you can create 1 degree of break. You can create a lateral break. You can create an offset like this. So this will still end up being read as kind of like one pad when you look at it from far away. When you look into it, it's like, oh, it's not perfectly this homogeneous lump. There's a bit, right? But when you introduce like 2 degrees of separation, when you go like this and like this is when you start seeing 2 pads instead of 1. This is a minor softening. This is a more dramatic softening. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, like for example, gosh, I kind of like this size of pad. Like what do I do with these? Like do I, if I squash them all together roughly, this starts looking bigger, right? Do I maybe say they're the same pad, but maybe I introduce like a horizontal offset? Or like this ends up being the body branch, but it's not exactly all together. I'm going to create just a bit of space there to make it appear visually a little bit differentiated. Does that make sense?
I've heard it said before that you shouldn't style a whole tree in one setting.
I see.
And I don't know if you subscribe to that philosophy.
I do style a whole tree in one setting. And I think that's primarily because of the point I brought up before, where when you style a tree, you're kind of resetting its system. You're telling it that, okay, well, maybe a branch that wasn't the top of the tree is now the top of the tree. So you know, maybe prioritize that growth and maybe deprioritize some others. So at least the way I work them, I find the most success, like, you know, having each styling be a reset. And each styling ends up itself being like a, it's almost like a, you know, some people prune the balance, right? And typically, it's typical across many species to try to balance the foliage mass of the tree, right? Because you want to bring down the stronger, keep the weaker around so that they end up balancing. When you're styling, assuming you're doing a, you know, you're doing a styling, a good styling, you're going to end up with a tree with fairly relatively evenly distributed foliage, right? And that itself not only has an aesthetic function, it balances the foliage on the tree, assuming, you know, don't go too far, of course, but I think basically it actually speeds up the development of the tree when you style it all at once, assuming you're doing it at the right time, when the tree is healthy, when the tree is in surplus, and when the tree, you know, isn't suffering from some kind of weakness. So, you know, potentially it's a case that you don't do too much to a tree that is not ready for it. That's definitely true. But if a tree, I rather wait for a tree to be totally ready than incrementally work a tree that like is never really ready for major work, if that makes sense. Also, something that is something that I've taken a bit more artistic license with in some of these like you know, less conventional trees that I work on, and that's not all of my trees, is that I you know, I introduce more movement into the even out to the branch tips. So I think in like a classically styled tree, you typically want to keep the movement relatively straightforward. Like, you know, you would have branches coming off the trunk down, you know, maybe if a bit of movement this way and that, but nothing too crazy. And then beyond that, you just want to like, you know, you want to keep the structure pretty consistent and pretty you know, I don't say straight, but like not wiggly. And you definitely don't want to, you know, create wiggles in a you know, there's a bad way to do wiggles, I guess. But I think for some of these trees that I work on that are wind influenced, I like the play of an undulation all the way out to the tip instead of just making it straight and having the growth come out of it. I might go like this and then this all the way at the end. I find it interesting. I think it creates a bit more interest all the way through the branch.
So when you're talking about wind influence, how much are you thinking about traditional windswept versus like actively blowing in the wind style?
Yeah, you know, I've been using the term wind influence, and like there are many versions of this in nature, right? Like I said, if you go to Pacifica, you will see a tree that is flat, just squashed on the hillside or whatever, right? And that is totally wind influence. It is not in the process of being blown, and that's been blown for a long time. You know, I like a more moderate representation. That is definitely a representation that exists, but I don't really like the trees that go like this. You know, I kind of like the trees that, the extent of wind influence that I like is that, oh, you know, the tree has more length on one side, a bit more compression on the other side, this kind of V-shaped tip, and so on. So definitely subjective. Though I used to think that, you know, those like very dramatic styles, like it almost made me think that the artist was portraying a tree that is being actively blown. But no, it is true. There are trees that just grow like that over the long term in kind of more extreme areas of wind. Any questions so far about the process? And by the way, my process is one of many potential processes to develop these trees. So don't take, you know, don't feel like, you know, this is the only way to do things. It's the way I've had success with. Also, just know that there are many parts that go into this, right? Because if you selectively take some of my advice here and you say, well, Sam said you should absolutely repot these trees straight into the bonsai container, and you didn't get the memo about leaving the foliage on and you know, tying the tree down really good and making sure you know, you don't style immediately after. You might get success if you might not experience success if you cherry pick some of this info. So
Sam, in your experience, can you look at a tree and tell that it's been styled by Bjorn as opposed to Michael Hagedorn, or as opposed to, I mean, do these artists leave their mark on it in such a way that you could tell one artist's work from the other?
I'm not exactly an art historian when it comes to bonsai, but definitely people whose work that I've seen a bunch of. Certainly, you can. I think most people, you don't have to be an expert. If you've seen enough of them, you can kind of tell. So I think so for select artists, um, um, especially for very particular species of trees, people handle them in specific ways. So I wouldn't say I'm like a, total expert, but I think so. I think so, and it's not just me. So do cypresses tend to grow well up here as well? I have this impression that they're just a very adaptable species as long as you can water them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there any for folks who grow it out here? What are the Sacramento specific troubles you have to deal with cultivating these trees? I'm curious.
Well, I've never had any issues with it. I did the traditional 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 when I was repotting it, 1/3 of the old soil replaced at a time. And it's always been very healthy and very happy. I keep it in 50% shade during the summertime and give it lots of water. It's now in 100% bonsai soil, and it just grows like a weed. Very happy.
What's the soil? What's the bonsai soil mix? I'm curious.
I think it's 50% akadama, 25% pumice, 25% lava, like a deciduous mix.
Oh, okay. So like 50% akadama. Cool.
But you use 100% akadama, did you say?
Yeah, I have been, and it's been working. Definitely not the only soil they can grow in.
Well, I like to water, so it gets plenty of water. Other trees suffer, but that one's happy.
Yeah, I kind of asked because I feel like I also feel like they're bulletproof in my environment, but I feel like I have the home turf advantage because I live in an environment where they are, their cousin, the Monterey cypress, is very prevalent. So it may be that I'm just getting away with shittier care. I sometimes feel the same for redwoods too. It's hard. I seem to have a lot easier time with redwoods than some of my friends who live elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So it may be that I don't have to be as on point of watering as someone else who is a bit more climate challenged for that tree. And then I feel the opposite way when it comes to some like mountain trees, like some Rocky Mountain juniper. They are finicky in my area, but definitely growable. But they demand a lot more from me. So quickly back to the work. I guess I'm finishing the pad here, so I lay some of these pieces in place. And again, I need less wire on this tree than in previous iterations because I have already laid out some of the structure. So once I kind of have a rough pad, that's when I start taking back the bottoms. Cutting back to achieve the fan shape, reconfiguring things here and there. Like I'm trying to, if I'm working at full speed, that's not to say it's very fast. It's a bit faster than this if I don't have to talk about it. But like I want to wire as little as possible. Not just to make this like a show tree or anything, but it's more efficient, And over time, as I've just gotten a bit more experienced at wiring, I've just learned how to wire less, how to achieve the same result with one piece of wire. Actually, I wish I had a good example here, but typically here's a little trick of wiring, right? Typically, sometimes if you have a bit of a fork, right? And you want to position both these branches, you don't always have to wire both of them and then put this here and put this here. You could have one piece of wire running up to one side of the branch. Wish I had a better example, right? Let's say I have this here. It's a V-shaped fork. I may not have to wire both these pieces, right? If I want to place, say I wire it all the way out here, I could use that wire to move this other pad into place that I want, up or down, left or right, and then, you know, use the rest of this wire to move this pad here. And I may have both these, you know, smaller bits of branching in the Y, like in the position I want, without having to apply two pieces of wire. So some of these tricks just kind of help you get through it faster.
Wow, what a difference. You've been working on that one branch, but what a difference in the look. It's gorgeous.
Thank you.
So it's a little unhappy.
It's the V.
See, it's a little wimpy. Keep it in the shade. Shade, and make sure it's well watered. And Scott,
but what is the soil? Is this just what it was?
it's bonsai soil. Well,
Okay,
no, it's.
All right, so Dodie, do you think we should wrap up soon?
Yes.
Cool. Well, I just wanted to roughly work like this one branch just to like roughly show you my process. Obviously, this will take a whole bunch more time and more tweaking. But just setting this bottom branch, I kind of like the fact that I broke this up into slightly smaller pads. It's a bit more interesting. I need to do a bit of fine tuning to make sure these tips are pointing the same way. But yes. Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry. I've been working in front of it. You know, it's either that or I turn the whole thing around and you guys see the back of the tree. Something like that. I think the placement is like ever so slightly off where the tips aren't really pointing in the exact same direction. So assuming I go with roughly this theme, this size of pad, this degree of separation, which I may or may not do, this, instead of being this one big chunk, you know, could be changed like this, right? Breaking this up and bringing this up, for example, breaking this into two separate pads, for example, that could work. And then maybe these somehow get swept aside to make room for these two to grow. So I think likely that's how I'm going to go about this. When I'm done, I'll send Dodie a picture, you know, come up in the newsletter or something, but I'm looking forward to it. This one of my favorites. So thanks for staying around. Appreciate it.